The night was dark, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. In the dim light of a flickering candle, a young man named Alex sat hunched over an ancient book, his eyes scanning the pages with a mix of curiosity and fear. The book, bound in leather and filled with cryptic symbols, spoke of a secret that had been hidden for centuries. It was a secret about the human soul, a secret that could change everything. Alex's heart raced as he read the words that seemed to leap off the page. The human mind, the book began, is a mystery, a blend of noble faculties that hint at something divine. Unlike the lower animals whose senses are tied to the physical world, the human mind can soar from heaven to earth, unravel the secrets of nature, and even glimpse the future through the lens of the past. He paused, his mind reeling. What did it mean to have a mind that could do such things? Was there really something more to humans than just flesh and bone? The book continued. This swiftness of thought, this ability to conceive of the invisible and the divine, is a clear sign that there is something within us that is separate from our bodies. We have intellect, which allows us to understand God and angels, things that the body alone cannot grasp. We have a sense of justice and morality, ideas that the physical senses cannot reach. These things must come from a spirit, a soul that is the true essence of who we are. Alex's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment he felt a deep, inexplicable fear. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw a faint glow emanating from the book itself. The pages seemed to be lit from within, revealing more of the ancient text. Even in sleep, the book continued, when the body seems to be in a state of stupor, the soul continues to work. It dreams of things that have never existed and foretells future events. This is no mere illusion, it is a testament to the soul's immortality. The book spoke of the soul as a separate entity, one that could exist beyond the physical body. It cited ancient scriptures and the words of great thinkers, all pointing to the same conclusion. The soul is the true essence of a human being. The book then delved into the concept of the soul being created in the image of God. Man was created in the image of God, it read, not just in his physical form, but in his soul. The divine image is spiritual, not material. It is the intellect, the sense of justice, and the capacity for love that make us like God. Even though the body may decay, the soul, which bears the divine image, continues to exist. Alex's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. If the soul was indeed the true essence of a person, what did that mean for his own life? Was there more to him than just the physical body he saw in the mirror every day? Could his soul really be a reflection of something divine? The book then spoke of the fall of man, of how the first humans, Adam and Eve, had lost their original purity. When Adam and Eve sinned, it read, they became alienated from God. The image of God in them was corrupted, but not completely destroyed. Through the grace of God and the work of Christ, the image can be restored. This restoration is a process of renewal, where the soul is transformed into the likeness of Christ. Alex felt a deep sense of purpose. If the soul could be renewed, then there was hope for him and for everyone. The book was more than just a collection of ancient words. It was a guide, a map to a deeper understanding of the human soul. As the night wore on, Alex continued to read, his mind opening to new possibilities. The book spoke of the soul's faculties, of how the intellect, will, and memory were all part of the divine image. It challenged the ideas of philosophers who had tried to define the soul in purely physical terms, and it rejected the dangerous notion that the soul was a part of God's essence. The more Alex read, the more he realized that the soul was a mystery, a gift from God that was both powerful and fragile. It was something to be cherished, nurtured, and protected. And in that realization, he found a new sense of purpose, a new direction for his life. The night was long, but the journey had only just begun. Alex closed the book, his heart filled with a sense of awe and wonder. The world outside was still dark, but inside, a light had been kindled. A light that would guide him on a path he had never imagined. The world we live in is not just a random collection of things. It's a place that God created and continues to watch over and take care of. Some people, like the Epicureans, thought that everything happened by chance, as if the world was just a big game of luck. But that's not true. God is in control, and He cares about every little thing that happens. Think about it this way. When you look up at the sky, you see the sun, the moon, and the stars. They're not just there by accident. God put them there, and He makes sure they keep moving in the right way. The sun rises and sets every day, not because it's following some random path, but because God is guiding it. The same goes for everything else in the world. The rain that waters the plants, the wind that blows the leaves, and even the tiny sparrow that sings in the tree. God is taking care of all of them. The Bible tells us this clearly. In the book of Psalms, David says, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all their host by the breath of His mouth." Psalm chapter 33, verse 6. He's not just talking about how the world was created. He's saying that God is still involved, still watching over everything. He goes on to say, "The Lord looks down from heaven and sees all the people." Psalm chapter 33, verse 13. This means that God isn't just a distant creator who made the world and then left it alone. He's an active God who is always present and always caring. Even in the smallest things, God's care is evident. David writes, "You make the grass grow for the cattle, and plants for people to use, so that they may bring forth food from the earth." Psalm chapter 104, verse 14. He's saying that God provides for all living things, not just humans. Every animal, every plant, and every person is part of God's plan and receives His care. Some people might say, but what about bad things that happen? If God is in control, why do bad things happen? This is a tough question, but the answer is that God's ways are not always clear to us. Just because we don't understand why something happens doesn't mean God isn't in control. In fact, the Bible tells us that even in difficult times, God is still with us and working for our good. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. The idea that everything happens by chance or fate is a common one, but it's not true. Some ancient philosophers, like the Stoics, believed in fate, saying that everything was predetermined and that we had no control over our lives. But the Bible teaches us that God is in control, and He gives us the freedom to make choices. Our choices matter, and they can affect our lives and the lives of others. When we understand that God is in control and that He cares for us, it changes the way we see the world. We can trust that even when things seem uncertain or difficult, God is still there, guiding and protecting us. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy, but it does mean that we are never alone. So, when you look at the world around you, remember that God is not just the creator, but also the sustainer. He is the one who keeps everything running, from the biggest stars to the smallest insects. Knowing this can give us peace and hope, even in the midst of challenges. In the world we live in, Many people believe that things happen by chance or luck, but the Bible teaches us a different story. It tells us that everything that happens is part of God's plan. This idea is called Providence, and it means that God is in control of everything, from the biggest events to the smallest details. Imagine you're walking through a forest, and suddenly a tree falls just missing you. Some might say it was luck. But if you believe in God's providence, you see it differently. You understand that God was watching over you, and He decided to keep you safe. The same goes for when good things happen, like finding a job or making a new friend. These aren't just random events. They are part of God's plan for your life. Now, think about the sun. It rises every morning and sets every evening, giving us light and warmth. The sun helps plants grow. It warms the earth and it makes life possible. But the Bible tells us that the sun doesn't just do these things on its own. God is the one who directs the sun to do its job. In fact, the sun didn't even exist until God created it. This shows us that God is not just a distant observer, but is actively involved in the world. Sometimes people try to explain things by saying they happen because of nature or the laws of the universe. But the Bible teaches us that even these natural laws are under God's control. For example, when Joshua prayed, God made the sun stand still. When Hezekiah was sick, God made the sun move backward. These miracles show that God can change the way nature works whenever He wants to. This means that every day, every hour, and every moment is governed by God's plan. But what about the bad things that happen? When we face challenges or difficulties, it can be hard to see God's hand at work. But the Bible tells us that even these hard times are part of God's plan. God uses them to teach us, to strengthen us, and to show us His love and care. For example, the Bible says that God provides for even the smallest creatures, like birds and flowers. If God takes care of them, He will certainly take care of us. Understanding God's providence also helps us trust Him more. When we know that God is in control, we can face our fears and worries with confidence. We don't need to be afraid of what might happen because we know that God is watching over us. This doesn't mean that we won't face challenges, but it does mean that we can trust God to guide us through them. In the end, God's providence is a reminder that we are not alone. God is with us, and He has a plan for our lives. Whether we are experiencing good times or bad, we can find comfort in knowing that God is in control. This understanding can help us live with peace and purpose, knowing that every moment is part of God's perfect plan. The idea that God is in control of everything might seem confusing or even scary, but it's actually a comforting thought. The Bible teaches that God isn't just watching from a distance. He's actively involved in the world, guiding everything according to His plan. This doesn't mean that everything is random or that God is a distant ruler. Instead, it means that even when things seem chaotic, God is still in charge. Let's look at some examples from the Bible. In the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, God sent a south wind to bring them quail to eat. Exodus chapter 16 verse 13, Numbers chapter 11 verse 31. This wasn't just a coincidence. God was providing for His people. Similarly, when Jonah was on the ship, God sent a storm to stop him from running away. Jonah chapter 1 verse 4. These events show that God uses natural things, like wind and storms, to carry out His plans. The Bible also tells us that God controls the weather and the sea. Psalms chapter 104, verse 3-4 says, "He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind." This means that God can use the wind and clouds to do his will. When the sea gets stormy, it's not just random. It's a sign of God's presence and power. The same is true when the storm calms down. Psalm chapter 107, verse 25-29. God is the one who brings both the storm and the calm. Even when it comes to having children, God is involved. In Genesis chapter 30, verse 2, Jacob tells Rachel, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" This shows that God is the one who decides whether someone will have children or not. It's a gift from him. When we pray for daily bread, we're not just asking for food. We're acknowledging that God is the one who provides for us. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3 says, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." This means that it's not just the food that keeps us alive, it's God's blessing that nourishes us. Sometimes people might think that if God is in control, then everything is predetermined and there's no such thing as free will. But that's not what the Bible teaches. God has a plan, but he also gives us the ability to make choices. However, even our choices are part of his bigger plan. For example, when Saul was chasing David, God used the Philistines to save David. 1 Samuel 23, 26-27. It might have seemed like a coincidence, but it was actually God's way of protecting his servant. The Bible also teaches that God has a special care for his people. He watches over the righteous and helps them in times of trouble. Psalm chapter 34, verse 15-16. This doesn't mean that bad things never happen to good people, but it does mean that God is always with them and working for their good. When we understand that God is in control, it changes the way we see the world. Instead of feeling like everything is random, we can trust that God is guiding everything for a purpose. This doesn't mean we won't face challenges, but it does mean that we can face them with confidence, knowing that God is with us. So, when you see a storm or a calm sea, or when you have a child or face a challenge, remember that God is behind it all. He is the one who makes the winds and the waves, and he is the one who provides for us. Trust in his care, and you'll find that even in the midst of uncertainty, you can have peace. God's care for the world and for us is like a vast unseen force that guides everything from the tiniest leaf to the grandest mountain. This force, called Providence, works in mysterious ways both in the past and the future. Sometimes, God uses things we can see and touch, like the sun, rain, or even people, to make things happen. Other times he works in ways we can't understand, and sometimes he even works against what we think should happen. Imagine you're walking through a dense forest. The trees are tall, and the path is hidden by leaves and shadows. You might think you're lost, but the forest has a way of guiding you even if you don't see it. God's providence is like that forest. It's always there, even when we can't see it, and it's always working to guide us. God's special care is especially seen in how he looks after the church, which is like a family of believers. He watches over this family more closely than he does over the rest of the world, making sure that his people are protected and guided. Sometimes, when bad things happen, we might think it's just random, or that God isn't paying attention, but that's not true. Even when we can't see why something is happening, God has a reason. He might be teaching us patience, helping us grow, or showing us that we need to change. just like a parent who might let a child fall to teach them to be careful. God sometimes allows hard things to happen so that we can learn and become better. Think about a storm. When you're in the middle of it, it's scary and confusing. But up in the sky, above the clouds, everything is calm and clear. God is like that calm sky, always in control, even when the world seems chaotic. Some people get upset when they can't understand why God does certain things. They might think God is being unfair, or that He's playing games with us. But we need to remember that God's wisdom is far greater than ours. Just like a child can't understand everything a parent does, we can't understand everything God does. We have to trust that He knows what He's doing, even if we can't see it. When we face hard times, we should remember that God is using those times to help us grow. He's not punishing us for no reason. He's teaching us something important. And when good things happen, we should thank God for His care and guidance. Some people argue that if God controls everything, then we don't need to try to make good choices or take care of ourselves. But that's not true. God has given us the ability to think and make decisions, and He expects us to use those gifts wisely. It's like if your parents give you a bicycle. They expect you to learn how to ride it and take care of it. God has given us the world and our lives, and He expects us to take care of them. When we make bad choices, we can't blame God. If someone steals or hurts others or does something wrong, they are still responsible for their actions. God might use those actions to teach us something, but that doesn't mean the person who did the wrong thing gets off the hook. They still have to face the consequences of their choices. So when we think about God's providence, we should remember that He is always in control, but He also expects us to use the gifts He's given us. We should trust that He has a plan, even when we can't see it, and we should do our best to live in a way that pleases Him. This way, we can find peace and strength, even in the most difficult times. The servant of God, firmly grounded in the promises and examples from Scripture, will also understand that all people, whether friends or enemies, are under God's control. This means that God can turn even the hearts of our enemies to favor us or prevent them from causing harm. For example, in the book of Exodus, God made the Egyptians favor the Israelites, helping them in their journey. Sometimes, God can make our enemies lose their wits, so they can't plan anything effectively. This is what happened to Ahab when God sent a lying spirit to deceive him, and to Rehoboam, whose foolish decision led to the division of his kingdom. When things go well, the Christian will thank God for every good thing, whether it comes through other people or through nature. For instance, if someone helps you, you should recognize that God has used that person to show His kindness. If you have a good harvest, you should see it as God's blessing, making the heavens and the earth work together for your benefit. This way, you can't help but feel grateful for everything you have. When bad things happen, the Christian will turn to God for comfort and strength. Joseph, when he was betrayed by his brothers, didn't focus on their treachery. Instead, he saw God's hand in it, believing that God had sent him to Egypt to save lives. Job, when he lost everything, didn't blame the Chaldeans who stole from him. Instead, he said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." David, when he was cursed by Shimei, didn't seek revenge. He understood that God was allowing it to happen for a reason. Paul teaches us that our real enemy is not other people, but the spiritual forces of evil. This helps us to avoid the urge to retaliate. Instead, we should remember that God is in control, and He uses even the devil and wicked people to test our patience and faith. When we face difficulties, we should remember that God is testing us, just as He tested the Israelites in the wilderness. If we don't learn from these trials, we are like the Jews, who didn't believe that both good and bad come from God. The Christian will also recognize the role of other people in their lives. While God is the ultimate source of all good things, we should still be grateful to those who help us. If someone does something kind for you, you should thank them and try to return the favor. If you make a mistake or neglect your duties, you should take responsibility for it, even though you believe God allowed it to happen for a reason. If someone commits a crime, you should see both God's justice and the person's wrongdoing. In the future, the Christian will be mindful of the help that others can provide. If you have the means to protect yourself, you should use them. But you should always remember that God is the one who ultimately guides everything. For example, Joab, before a battle, encouraged his men to be brave and do their best, but he also acknowledged that the outcome was in God's hands. This balance between taking action and trusting God will keep you from being overly confident or overly fearful. When we truly believe in God's providence, we can face life's challenges with joy and trust. Without this belief, life would be filled with constant fear and anxiety. Every step we take could be a step toward danger. But when we know that God is in control, we can walk through the darkest valleys without fear. The psalmist says, "The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" This confidence comes from knowing that God is always with us, protecting us and guiding us. In the world we live in, things often seem random and unpredictable. Sometimes it might feel like everything is spinning out of control. But for those who believe in God, there's a different perspective. They see that even when the world seems chaotic, God is always in charge. This belief gives them a deep sense of peace and security. They know that no matter what happens, God is guiding everything, and His plan will ultimately protect them. Imagine you're walking through a dark forest. It's scary, and you can't see where you're going. But then you remember that your friend is walking beside you, holding a flashlight. Even though the forest is dark, you feel safe, because you know your friend is there, guiding you. For believers, God is like that friend with the flashlight. He's always there, even when things seem dark and scary. When bad things happen, like when someone is mean to you, or when you face a big challenge, it can be really hard. But believers find strength by thinking about God's plan. They remember that even the worst people, like bullies or those who do evil, are under God's control. God can use even the bad things to bring about good. It's like when a teacher gives you a hard test to help you learn. The test might be tough, but it's for your own good. In the Bible, there's a story about a man named Paul. He wanted to go on a journey, but something stopped him. At first, he thought it was the devil trying to keep him from doing God's work. But later, Paul realized that God was in control. He understood that the devil couldn't stop him unless God allowed it. This gave Paul the courage to keep going, knowing that God was guiding his path. Another story is about King David. He faced many challenges and dangers, but he always turned to God for help. He said, "My times are in your hand." This means that no matter what happened, David believed God was in control of his life. Even when things were tough, he found comfort in knowing that God was watching over him. Sometimes, the Bible talks about God repenting or changing his mind. For example, it says that God was sorry he made humans, or that he decided not to punish a city. But this doesn't mean God actually changes his mind like we do. Instead, it's a way of explaining that God is giving people a chance to change. When God tells someone they will face trouble, it's often to warn them so they can turn back to him. It's like a parent warning a child not to touch a hot stove. The warning is to help, not to hurt. When the people of Nineveh were told they would be destroyed, they were scared. But instead of giving up, they decided to change their ways. God saw this and decided not to punish them. This shows that God's warnings are always a chance for people to turn back to him. He wants to save people, not destroy them. In the end, the Bible teaches that God is always in control, even when it doesn't seem like it. He uses everything, even the bad things, to bring about his good plans. This is why believers can have hope and peace, even in the darkest times. They know that God is with them, guiding them every step of the way. As we journey through the pages of sacred history, we see a tapestry woven with threads of divine purpose and human action. The story of God's involvement in the world is not one of mere observation, but of active participation. From the crucifixion of Christ to the rebellions of kings, every event is part of a larger plan, a plan that God has known and orchestrated from the beginning. When we read about the Jews who sought to destroy Jesus, or the soldiers who carried out the crucifixion, we might wonder how such evil could be part of God's will. Yet, the disciples in their prayers acknowledged that even the wicked actions of men were part of God's greater plan. Peter, in his teachings, reminds us that Christ's death was not a random act, but a fulfillment of God's foreknowledge and decree. This doesn't mean that God condones the evil. Rather, it means that even in the darkest moments, God's will is being done. We see this pattern throughout the Bible. Absalom's incestuous act, though detestable, is described as God's work, a punishment for David's sins, the cruelties of the Chaldeans in Judea, the revolt of the 10 tribes, and the death of Eli's sons. All these events, though tragic, are seen as God's judgments. Even the Assyrian, called the rod of God's anger, and the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, referred to as God's servant, are instruments in God's hands, carrying out his will, whether they realize it or not. But how does God's will come to pass in the hearts of men? The Bible tells us that God can turn a king's heart like a river of water, directing it wherever he pleases. This means that our thoughts and actions, though they seem to come from within us, are ultimately guided by God's unseen hand. When God hardens Pharaoh's heart, or blinds the minds of those who reject him, it is not a mere permission, but an active intervention. God uses even the wicked to accomplish his purposes, though they remain responsible for their actions. This might seem confusing. How can God be just if he uses the wicked to carry out his will? The answer lies in understanding that God's will is not the same as his command. When Absalom defiles his father's bed, God is not commanding him to do so. Rather, God is using Absalom's sin to bring about a greater purpose. Similarly, when Shimei curses David, David recognizes that God has ordered it, but he does not commend Shimei for obeying a divine command. Instead, David sees it as a form of divine discipline and submits to it. The same principle applies to the election of Jeroboam as king. God's will is complex. On one hand, he did not want the people to rebel against the house of David. On the other hand, he used Jeroboam to punish Solomon's ingratitude. The people's rebellion is condemned, but God's purpose is fulfilled. This duality shows us that God's will is not always simple or straightforward. It is a mystery that we cannot fully comprehend, but we can trust that it is always just and good. In the end, we must remember that God's will is a unity. It does not contradict itself, though it may seem to us that God wills and wills not the same thing. This is only because of our limited understanding. God's wisdom is beyond our grasp, and His ways are higher than our ways. As the Apostle Paul reminds us, God's wisdom is a hidden mystery, and it is through this mystery that His manifold wisdom is revealed. So as we close this chapter, let us hold on to the truth that God is sovereign over all things. Even when the world seems chaotic and evil seems to prevail, we can take comfort in knowing that God is in control. He is the author of all that happens, and He will bring about His good and perfect will. In the face of this truth, let us be humble and trust in His wisdom, even when we cannot understand it. For in the end, God's justice and goodness will be made known, and all things will be brought to their rightful conclusion.